Okay. All right, everybody. Welcome back for some of you. For some of you, maybe you're just coming. If you're able to attend the earlier session, that's great. If not, that's fine too. Basically, today I'm going to be doing something that is a huge, huge part of period 7, and that is foreign policy. Foreign policy is something that inevitably could show up on the day of the AP test. And so we want to timeline it so that we can see some of the big changes and the big continuities within American foreign policy. So what I got here is the sheet of paper that I've been working off of, and we're going to divide this up into like 2 parts. On this first sheet of paper, I'm going to timeline for you really foreign policy from the end of the American Revolution all the way through 1898. And then starting in 1898, which is the beginning of period 7, I'm going to timeline really what's happened from 1898 to 1945, because it really, foreign policy becomes such a larger part of the story of the United States when we get into period 7. And we want to kind of be able to know all those different things. But there is a lot to know in the first part as well. So let's get going on this. So we're going to be timelining foreign policy. And if you have not done one of these yet with me, I highly recommend that you kind of take your own notes, that you write this down maybe in a notebook, just because for me, when I write stuff down, I remember it better. It makes more sense to me. So what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be walking you through what are some of the things that you need to know about American foreign policy from the start of our history to the end. So we're going to begin by drawing that timeline, which we've been doing for all these different sessions. And for foreign policy, we really want to start when America becomes its own independent country. Prior to 1783, our foreign policy had been, for the most part, dictated by the British. So we were a part of the British Empire, and so for the most part, we didn't have a lot of control over foreign policy. But we want to kind of obviously kind of talk about, once America's independent, how it starts to view itself. So we know that, prior to 1783, the only foreign policy that you need to be aware of is that America did have an alliance with France during the Revolution, and that we depended on France for help during the American Revolution in order for us to be able to survive. But it's like, that's not so important. That's not going to be our focus here. Our focus is going to be, once America is its own country, how did we start to see America starting to define itself in terms of foreign policy? Now, between 1783 and 1790, the United States doesn't really have much foreign policy because we're under the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation does not give the federal government a lot of power to do much of anything. So there's very limited foreign policy during this time period. In fact, we have states making some of their own foreign policy as opposed to a foreign policy being created by the government. In 1790, after we have the Constitution formed, that's when you start to see a more unified foreign policy that's being established by the central government. So we want to talk a little bit about, after 1790, what does that foreign policy look like? So I'm going to really kind of just mark a few dates here on our timeline. I'm going to mark 1790 here, and then I'm going to kind of talk a little bit in a second at about 1823. That's going to be an important date that I'll come to in a second. And then our last time period that I'm going to mark off here is 1898, because that's going to be kind of a shift. So let's talk a little bit about what is America doing during this time period. So early on, after America becomes its own independent country, one of the earliest concerns is our economic system. If you remember, during the American Revolution, America struggled to trade. That continues. America has massive debts after the war, and it's one of the challenges that Alexander Hamilton has to face. once he becomes Secretary of Treasury. And so from really the start of American history throughout, America has always had a policy of trying to, I'm going to go through and put an arrow along this entire time period. And this is going to continue really even to today. We've always had a foreign policy of trying to regulate trade, and essentially like make like trade agreements in order to I guess boost America's economy. So I bring that up first because I think sometimes we forget about that as foreign policy. So when we're making trade agreements with other countries, when we're deciding, when we're going to war to try to protect our right to trade, that is considered American foreign policy, and we have to acknowledge that. That's definitely a category that could come up if you ever get a question from this time period. So throughout this entire time period, America is regulating trade and trying to do things that'll boost its economy. And we see this in a number of ways that are both successful and sometimes unsuccessful, in the form of, like, for example, the Embargo Act, or there is obviously like tariffs, protective tariffs that are placed on different foreign products throughout this time period. But throughout, obviously, America is trying to regulate trade. Also early on, we could even talk about how America sent its fleet to fight the Barbary pirates, to protect our right to trade. So all of this is going on throughout American history. So that's going to be one of these stories that I want you to be aware of. The next story that I want you to know about in terms of foreign policy deals with America having a consistent policy of what we call neutrality. So I'll take a different color. I'm going to put neutrality here. And this is a really important foreign stance that America takes early on in our history. So this concept of neutrality is going to last for throughout almost this entire time period, okay, where the United States is not going to create any kind of foreign alliances with any other countries. In fact, the first time that we ever see America starting to join foreign alliances isn't until 1898, after 1898, in the next period that we're gonna talk about. So where does this policy of neutrality come from? Well, it starts because of the French Revolution. Now, if you guys remember right, way back here during the American Revolution, the French had given America aid. And so we had, as part of that alliance with France, we had basically agreed to help France if they ever needed our assistance. And by the time Washington becomes president, there is the beginnings of the French Revolution, which begins in 1789. And there are calls by a lot of people, including the Secretary of State at the time, Thomas Jefferson, for America to get involved and help France. This creates this huge debate in this country about whether or not America should get involved. Now, for those who said we shouldn't get involved, it's not that they didn't want to honor this treaty, but the treaty that we had was with the French monarch who was being overthrown. And so there was real questions about whether or not we were obligated to do this, or whether we even were powerful enough to do it. So we see neutrality being a major stance that America is taking in the 1790s. And it begins with Washington's proclamation of neutrality. So that's kind of the beginning of it, where Washington decides to take this official stance in which he says that the United States is not going to get involved in the French Revolution. I'm going to zoom in here so we can see this a little bit better. There we go. Now, there are other things, obviously, that build on this initial proclamation of neutrality. So we see the farewell address, Washington's farewell address, in which he basically warns against getting involved with foreign alliances. And Washington's farewell address also warned about getting involved in political parties. That part was pretty much ignored as we see the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans starting to emerge. But the part of his farewell address that was respected by both parties moving forward was this idea of avoiding foreign entanglements. And Washington believed that we weren't strong enough as a country to really get involved in European affairs, and that could end up hurting us in the long run. And so he advocated for that. Now, in this time period, even though political parties change hands, they still kind of continue this concept of neutrality. When Jefferson and the Democratic Republicans come to power, we see them also trying to maintain their neutrality. So Jefferson, who's facing his own challenges in the form of British ships and even French ships impressing American sailors during the Napoleonic Wars, attempts to try to maintain neutrality or protect American neutrality with the Embargo Act. And if you don't remember what the Embargo Act was, is where Jefferson cuts off all trade with foreign countries. And his thinking was that if those countries can't are going to continue to impress our sailors, that the best way for America to guarantee its neutrality is to basically cut off ties with the rest of the world. And so we stopped trading with these other countries. Now, this has a horrible impact on our economy, but the purpose of it is to maintain neutrality. And then we go into, under James Madison's presidency, the War of 1812. And the War of 1812 was also largely fought to maintain American neutrality. And it was fought to maintain American neutrality because, once again, the British were impressing American sailors, which meant that they were kidnapping Americans off of American ships and forcing them to serve in the British Navy. We saw this as a violation of our rights at sea. And just a general disrespect for America as a whole. And so part of the War of 1812 was fought, ironically, so that other countries would respect our right to remain neutral. When it's all said and done, America earned some respect during the War of 1812, but we maintain our neutrality throughout this time period. Now, 1823 is an important date because in 1823, we kind of expand on this concept of neutrality. And we expand on this concept of neutrality in the form of saying that not only are we going to be neutral, but we also start to take an anti-colonization stance. So not only are we neutral, but we also begin to, in 1823, warn other countries to respect our neutrality by staying out of the Western Hemisphere. And the best example of what I'm talking about here is in 1823, there's the Monroe Doctrine. Now, after the Napoleonic Wars, there was fears that European countries would try to come back into America, like the Western Hemisphere, into the Americas, and start recolonizing it. And that would not only threaten independence of people around the world, it would not only go against our democratic values, but it would also threaten our own neutrality, because as these European countries would come over to our part of the world, it might mean that it would draw the United States into foreign entanglements, like foreign wars. And so the Monroe Doctrine is this kind of strong stance that the United States takes that says for other European countries to stay out of our side of the world. And we're going to remain neutral, but we're also going to become the defenders of the Western Hemisphere, and that we fight against colonization, or at least recolonization, of parts of America, South America, and the Caribbean. And we never had to go to war over that issue because we had the backing of Great Britain, who also didn't want to see other European countries in this side of the world. But it's kind of building on that concept of neutrality throughout this time period. Okay, so that is another. So we got these two important stories that are forming so far. We've got the regulation of trade that's ongoing. We've got this American commitment to neutrality that's also happening during this time period. We're going to get to our next story, and our next story is connected to what we just talked about earlier today, which is control over Native Americans. Almost immediately, the United States as part of its foreign policy, starts to seek to control Native Americans. So I'm just going to start numbering these stories here. So we got story 1, which is regulation of trade. We've got story 2, which is neutrality. And then we've got story 3, which is control over Native Americans. Now I'm going to zoom in on this story here so that we have a better look at it. And obviously, as I said earlier, for those, some of you might not have been a part of that earlier review, but from the get-go, Native Americans were not viewed as part of the United States. They were viewed as a foreign entity. And so the United States basically saw them as a foreign power that was on the soil that they believed belonged to them. Okay, so that in itself posed a foreign policy issue. And this is something that's really important for us to know, because there are a lot of people who forget about this part of our foreign policy in early American history. We don't think of America's relationship with Native Americans as part of foreign policy, but it is, and it's an important part of that story. So we can see under Washington some of the earliest examples of the United States trying to control Native Americans. The Treaty of Greenville, for example, which is signed under Washington, and it's for control over the Northwest Territory, which the United States believed that they had access to, or they had rights to, after the American Revolution and the Treaty of Paris. Okay, the War of 1812, which happens a little later, also deals with Native American history, because it's about trying to control Native Americans who are viewed as a foreign threat. Once again, in the West, Native Americans, in this case Tecumseh, even side with the British during the War of 1812, and so this is considered to be a foreign threat that the United States needs to take control of. Now, for those, by 1850, control over Native Americans changes as we start to see, in 1851, the Treaty of Fort Laramie, which establishes reservations. And then we start to see a series of wars between the United States and Native Americans over control of their own freedoms, their own rights. Obviously, they are living now on American territory, on reservations, and the United States is going to go to war with them in order to try to enforce this policy of reservations. We see this in a number of incidences. Probably one of the best examples is the Second Sioux Wars, and then the Second Sioux War, that's when the Battle of Little Bighorn happens, and that is in 1876. Now, the story ends by really 1890, as the United States goes through this process of assimilation and begins to dissolve tribes and no longer sees them as a foreign entity. And then from that period on, we start to see in the 1900s, the United States, instead of treating Native Americans as a foreign entity, we start to see that switch over to Native Americans as American citizens, okay? And so by the end of the 1800s, the Native Americans are no longer considered to be part of our foreign policy. All right, that takes us to our last story that I want to cover. And our last story that I'm going to cover deals with westward expansion. So throughout this time period, America is also really spending a lot of time, there we go, zoom out, spending a lot of time and a lot of energy in terms of foreign policy trying to gain more land for itself. So westward expansion becomes an important part of our foreign policy. And we can see this over and over again throughout the 1800s as the United States is constantly get involved in other countries in order to try to gain land. Sometimes we gain land through treaties, sometimes we gain land through force. So I'm just going to go through a series of different events during this time period that shows that America is constantly kind of gearing its foreign policy towards westward expansion. So we see in the 1790s, for example, Picktons Treaty. Picktons Treaty, example of foreign westward expansion, because the United States is trying to basically determine the southern border between like Florida and the United States. We're also, this is also part of regulating trade, because the United States is also trying to gain access to New Orleans so that we can send goods down the Mississippi River and deposit them in an area that was controlled by Spain at the time. Another probably better example of westward expansion is under Jefferson, and we've got the Louisiana Purchase. (1803). And the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 is obviously doubles the size of the United States. It is considered to be it's a treaty. It was negotiated with France and specifically Napoleon. And it is another example of us using our diplomacy and our foreign policy to gain more land for the United States. There's going to be other examples that I'm not going to mention here, so we can talk about like the Adams-O'Neill Treaty, or the Florida Purchase. There's the Alaska Purchase in 1865. There's all these land purchases that are going to be made. But I also want to talk about times where we went to war in order to gain land as well. So we didn't go to war to do this, but it sets up another war, which is in 1844, we annexed Texas. 1844, and that's going to put us on bad terms with Mexico, which means that when we go to then purchase California, they refuse. We pick a war with California, specifically with Mexico to gain California, and that sets up the Mexican-American War 2 years later. And then we're at the same time, we're threatening to fight Great Britain for Oregon, and we see the 54-40 or fight slogan being popular and thrown around. So you can see America's foreign policy throughout this time period is also actively trying to expand new territories and new lands. And that's being done for a number of reasons. Nationalism is driving this, but also like in Jefferson's day, it was the desire for more land for farmers. During this time period, it was the desire for more land in Texas to spread cotton, and that drove the growth of cotton in the economy of the South. And then California became a very, very valuable and desirable piece of land by the time the Mexican-American War rolled around. After this, you've got the purchase of Alaska in the 1860s, and then we're going to see more desire for land overseas by the time we get past 1898. So this is our early foreign policy. So it's really kind of dominated by these four stories: regulation of trade, neutrality, control over Native Americans, and a desire for westward expansion. But I want you to notice that there's also changes that are happening throughout this time period. America is exerting itself more from the start of this time period to the end. Yes, America is neutral during this time period, but you can see America is being more aggressive in trying to protect its neutrality. It's also becoming more militaristic. We go from not thinking we're strong enough to do anything under Washington's proclamation of neutrality to really by 1812 fighting a war for that neutrality. We become more aggressive in our expansion for land. So there are some clear continuities and changes that we're going to talk more about in a second, but that you should know for our early foreign policy. So that is the first step. Now, this next part I want to talk about kind of separate, because this is this takes us up all the way to period 7. But period 7 is where we start to see our foreign policy really become one of the driving stories in American history. So obviously during first semester, we did talk a little bit about that stuff, but we didn't spend as much time talking about it. But by the time we got to period 7, and we're talking about 1898 and beyond, foreign policy is a huge part of what is defining America in the 20th century and beyond. Now, we're not going to have to talk about that entire story. So much of that story happens after World War II in period 8, when America is becoming a superpower, and we really see America becoming one of the leading countries in the world. We don't need to know that for the AP test this year, but we want to know at least how we got to that point. You know, what happened in between that got America to become that superpower and to get America more involved in the world. So we're going to start our timeline for the second part in 1898, which is an important date. And then we're going to kind of make a note of World War I, which is between, for America at least, 1917 to 1919. And then we're going to make a note of really 1940, which is going to kind of mark the beginning of America's entry or increasing involvement in World War II. So obviously the world wars that are happening during this time period are going to play a huge role in shaping America's foreign policy. So we want to talk a little bit about, okay, what defines America's foreign policy? And this is all period 7 right now. So the first thing we're going to talk about, like unlike the previous timeline that I showed you where there were ongoing stories, this time period can be kind of chunked out into like specific things that explain American foreign policy. So really America's foreign policy is defined in this first time from 1898 to really 1917 in World War I by the theme of, or story of, imperialism. So imperialism is ongoing during this time period. Okay, so we want to talk a little bit about what imperialism is. Imperialism was this desire for America to not only expand within the continental United States, but actually to try to expand and develop an empire overseas. And so for the first time, the United States sought to become more influential around the world, something that we had resisted up until this time period because we had followed this view of neutrality. We had followed this view of anti-colonization, which had gone back all the way to the time of George Washington. Now, the reason why we start to see imperialism begin is a number of different factors. Probably the most important thing you know is that this comes right after the Industrial Revolution. So after the Industrial Revolution, the United States is seeking to continue to grow its economy. It's in search of new markets. And so for some Americans, imperialism makes sense. The West, by this time here, it is closed, and so they want to find new places to sell their goods to. Probably the most important event, I'm going to get started, that kicks off imperialism is the Spanish-American War. And the Spanish-American War happens in 1898. That's what we consider to be the beginnings of imperialism or an imperialistic policy in the United States. And the Spanish-American War results in America kind of being viewed as a world power, but it also results in the United States gaining new territories that it hadn't had before. So because of the Spanish-American War, all of a sudden the United States gets access to, actually gains the territory of Puerto Rico, gains the territory of Guam, and as part of that, the United States decides to annex the Philippines. And that is a big deal. Because all of a sudden the United States' influence is spreading across the Pacific. At the same time we are fighting the Spanish-American War, the United States also annexes Hawaii. Which it had long been interested in. And so that's going on during, like at the same time that we're starting to fight the Spanish-American War, but those are two separate incidents. And then from that point on, under McKinley, who's the president when this begins, we see a number of other things that shows America becoming increasingly involved in the world and actually seeking to build an empire. So America helps negotiate, for example, the open door policy. With China. So the United States begins to basically negotiate for greater trade in China. So all of this is happening under McKinley. And what ends up taking place afterwards is that in the aftermath, we've got a number of presidents who are coming into power who are continuing this process of imperialism. So you've got Teddy Roosevelt, and his big stick policy, also imperialistic. And the best example of that would be, it's under Teddy Roosevelt that we take the Panama Canal. And it's like Teddy Roosevelt is imperialism because, we see him, basically he's trying to negotiate for the United States, but when those negotiations break down, he is willing to use the military force in order to get to build up American power. After Teddy Roosevelt, you've got Taft, and Taft's policy is called dollar diplomacy, which, for those that don't remember dollar diplomacy is this belief that the United States should intervene whenever it is in our financial interest. So America is going to get involved in countries when it's economically beneficial to us. So if countries owe us money, then we're willing to get involved. We're willing to intervene. And then that takes us to the least imperial, but still is expanding American power during this time period, and that's Woodrow Wilson, who's also going to be the president during World War I. And his policy is what we call moral diplomacy. Blank there for a second. Moral diplomacy. Okay, and moral diplomacy is this idea that America should get involved around the world to spread our own values and to obviously try to spread democracy to other places, which makes sense because this is that he's president during World War I. Because one of the reasons he's going to give for America getting involved in that war is that we're going to make the world safe for democracy. We're going to spread our democratic ideas during World War I. Okay, so World War I is super influential in American foreign policy because we get involved in World War I, and like World War I represents kind of the end of this era of imperialism, and also at the same time the start of a new era in foreign policy for the United States. And like Woodrow Wilson, we get involved in World War I for a number of reasons. Woodrow Wilson's talking about like spreading democracy, and we're also talking about maybe helping to end that war and getting involved for economic interests. There's also issues involving like Germany and the fact that American ships are being targeted and American civilians need to be protected because they're getting caught in the crossfire. If you remember, obviously, the sinking of the Lusitania, for example, the Zimmerman telegram, and other stuff like that. But World War I kind of changes the American mindset. We get involved in that war, and when it's all said and done, like Americans go overseas, we mobilize for that war. There's lots of sacrifice that's made here in this country, not nearly the sacrifice that's made by other countries, but Americans feel it. And even though we're involved for a short period of time, there's this feeling after the war is over that America didn't really accomplish anything, that we didn't really like get the things that we want accomplished, taken care of because of that war. And the result of that is kind of a disillusionment with foreign policy that grows after World War I. A lot of Americans start to feel regret for having gotten involved in that. And we start to see growing feelings of, I'm going to make sure we write this down, isolation. So this time period, immediately following World War I, and like leading us up through the 30s into the 1940s, is defined by feelings of isolationism within America. And what I mean by that is that there's a lot of people that would like America to not get involved in foreign policy. They want us to withdraw from the world. They say, you know, we're not ready to be a superpower. America should not be, you know, super involved in foreign affairs. You know, and they want to kind of worry more about what's happening inside the United States. And there's a number of things that happen that demonstrate these feelings of isolationism after World War I. The biggest example, the one that you obviously have to know to understand isolationism, is the rejection of the Treaty of Versailles in 1919. So this is probably one of the greatest failures of Woodrow Wilson's presidency. If you remember right, the United States, we go to war basically promising that we're going to help create a fair and lasting peace. Woodrow Wilson creates the 14 points, which are supposed to be a model for the Treaty of Versailles. And when we go to negotiate this thing, there's just a lot of hard feelings on both sides. And the treaty that comes out of World War I is not the treaty that really a lot of Americans were hoping for. And so there's this growing feelings against the Treaty of Versailles, and there's a lot of Americans who are, as they start to become more isolationist, are especially concerned about the creation of a League of Nations. They're afraid that a League of Nations will lead to America becoming more involved in foreign policy, that will lose some of our autonomy and our sovereignty. And so there's this movement against the Treaty of Versailles that actually gets it rejected. And so that rejection of the Treaty of Versailles basically creates this chain reaction in which America becomes increasingly, I guess, withdrawn from the rest of the world. We don't join the League of Nations, don't ratify the Treaty of Versailles, and then we start to do things in the 1920s and the 1930s that pull us out of world affairs. So that doesn't mean we're not involved at all. There are things like, for example, the Washington Naval Conference, where we invite countries from around the world to basically disarm and to try to reduce the number of ships that are like currently being used by Great Britain and Japan and the United States and all these world powers. But there's kind of an ulterior motive to things like the Washington Naval Conference, because a big part of our motivation was, if we can limit like arms around the world, then maybe that means that we won't have to worry about like getting involved in another world war. As like the 1930s roll on, we've got the Great Depression hitting, and the Great Depression is important to isolationism because it further makes Americans concerned about like what's happening here in our country. You know, we can't be bothered with what's happening overseas because we got to take care of ourselves. We're concerned about the rising unemployment. FDR is concerned about obviously just making sure that his New Deal is successful. And as Americans are focused on the Great Depression, we see overseas like a number of dictators coming to power. And those dictators are going to be one of the driving factors to the build up to World War II. Hitler, Mussolini, we see the rise of military generals in Japan, even Stalin. And so the United States is aware of these things happening overseas, but it's not really concerned about it because they're more focused on themselves. In fact, they begin to start to revise history in the 1920s. There's a commission that is designed to study World War I, something called the Nye Committee. And they determined that the real cause of World War I was that like American businesses just wanted to make lots of money selling weapons overseas. And this kind of revisionist history shows how America is really starting to, like, I guess, change their view of themselves in the world. Even though America is a world power after World War I, we're not acting like one. We're withdrawing from the world. We even see as World War II ramps up, the United States committed to neutrality by passing the Neutrality Acts. And what the Neutrality Acts do, which were in the 1930s, there was actually a series of them, like what they do is they keep America from being able to get involved and stop these dictators from aggressively taking over countries in Europe or countries in Asia. Even as our allies fall to these powers, like for example, China, one of our main trading partners, falls to Imperial Japan. Even as, obviously we see Poland invaded, the United States doesn't act and instead maintains its neutrality, hoping that like the buildup to World War II won't affect us. By 1940, that changes because it becomes clear by 1940, after the fall of France, that the United States absolutely cannot remain on the sidelines during World War II. Now, FDR, our president, had been pushing for us to get more involved for a while, and now America and public opinion starts to finally turn towards doing something about this. So we see, starting in 1940, America become an interventionist country. Meaning we're now going to get involved in world affairs, and we see America emerging as a world power. Not only that, but a superpower. The United States is kind of finally embracing its status as a world power, and it will continue to do that following World War II. So we see examples of that early on. Starting in 1940, we see the beginning of preparedness, where Franklin D. Roosevelt introduces a peacetime draft. So, even before we're involved in World War II, the United States begins drafting people into military service, and that obviously starts to get us mobilized for the war. We also see, even before war is declared, the Lendlease Act. And the Lendlease Act is going to start to give supplies to Great Britain during the war to try to help them out because they're under attack from Nazi Germany. And then obviously after Pearl Harbor, America's entry into World War II confirms America's role in the world and allows America to emerge as a superpower. Okay, and that's we can see America taking a more active role from that point on, especially towards the end of the war when you start to get into the conferences like the Yalta Conference, where the major powers, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, start to dictate what the post-war world will look like, and the same thing at Potsdam. So it's clear that after World War II, America, unlike World War I, is not going to, it's embracing its role as a world power, and we're going to see that moving forward. And we see that throughout all of period 8 as we start to get into the Cold War. But that's not stuff that you're going to have to know for this test, so I'm going to not spend as much time on that. Obviously, if you can connect this to later time periods, that just shows that you're have a better historical understanding of foreign policy. But this is kind of the big things that you need to know for our class, at least for the test on May 15th. So just be aware of that. There are these are some very important stories from this earliest time period with regulating trade, neutrality, control over Native Americans and westward expansion, to moving into this period of imperialism, isolationism, and then finally kind of re-embracing our role as a superpower.